Look at these buildings in downtown Cairo. Do they remind you of anything? Do they not remind you a little bit of the types of buildings you would see in Paris or Vienna? See, this area of Cairo was once upon a time called the Ismailia district, but today it's known by the more common name of downtown Cairo, West al-Balad, the place that had this revolution, this statue, and this movie scene was once upon a time named after this man, Khedive Ismail Pasha. Khedive Ismail is probably the most important Egyptian leader that you have never heard of. As Tariq Osman describes it in this book, quote, "In effect, he commissioned the building of modern Cairo. He oversaw the building of the Cairo Opera House, the National Library that held hundreds of thousands of Arabic, Turkish, and European texts, the Egyptian Geographical Society, the Giza Zoo, so on and so forth. That's not to mention the most important thing built under Ismail Pasha's rule, the Suez Canal." The thing is though, all of this development came at a cost, and Ismail Pasha didn't exactly have the money to pay for all these things. As Galal Amin says in the story of the Egyptian economy, Ismail's debts reached tens of millions of pounds. That brings us to an important question. Who did Ismail owe all this money to? That's a good question. And its answer? Britain and France. Welcome to episode 4 of Egypt's recent history. Last time we talked about Muhammad Ali's legacy and whether or not he was a good leader. We said that he effectively brought the country into the modern era, albeit with a lot of inequality. And his descendants, which included Ismail Pasha, pretty much continued this legacy of modernization with inequality. Much of this development, though, was reliant on foreigners, or more specifically, foreign money, especially French and British money. That would lead to something that wasn't great. First and foremost, the British wanted a way to reach India, as Napoleon had wanted about 70 years earlier. And if India is the crown jewel of the British Empire, then Egypt is the road to that crown jewel. So the British were willing to engage in some colonialism. Now the second thing that they wanted was their money back. Ismail Pasha was heavily indebted to them and he couldn't quite pay, and Egypt's revenues weren't really enough to pay back the full amount. As Galal Amin says it in this book, Ismail Pasha was forced to accept French and British monitors, who then managed the money that was given to them for loan payments. In effect, the French and the British had quite a lot of influence over the Egyptian treasury. This type of economic colonialism, though, wasn't unique to Egypt. As Jean Ghazvinian says in this book, Iran suffered a similar experience when paying back loans to Russia and Britain. Anyway, the British and the French also had other economic interests as well. One example was the Suez Canal. When it was first created, the Suez Canal Company was about 44% Egyptian owned and 50% French owned. But then Ismail Pasha, to service his debts, was forced to sell off Egypt's shares of the canal company to the British. So by this point, with the British having a lot of influence over the country, the Egyptian people didn't really like it. As these two sources say, Ismail Pasha tried to resist British and French control over the economy and called in a new government to implement a more nationalistic plan. The British didn't exactly like this, so they, along with the French, called on the Ottoman Sultan to remove Ismail from power, which he did. The British and the French may have thought that this would be the end of it, but they were wrong. This was only the beginning. See, this is where we bring in a very important name, Ahmed Urabi. Ahmed Urabi was a military officer who came from Egypt's agricultural delta region, or the Fallahin region. He was, in essence, a man who came from the working class. That background mattered, because it differed greatly from the Turkish-Albanian ruling class established by Muhammad Ali. That ruling class had a heavy European political and cultural tilt. Many French, Italians, Greeks, Armenians, and many other nationalities came to settle in Egypt at this time. Many of their descendants, in fact, still live in the country, as shown in this documentary covering the lives of modern-day European Egyptians living in Alexandria. These Europeans, though, came from a culture that was quite different from the average Egyptian. The average Egyptian didn't really live the experiences of the Enlightenment, or any of the recent European upheavals, and didn't really relate to the Turkish Albanian ruling class. Ahmed Urabi represented the average Egyptian, and as this Wikipedia article says, it gave him a lot of popularity. He was one of the people. Urabi would launch a rebellion against the ruling monarchy, and this rebellion mattered because it was the beginning of a native Egyptian uprising against colonialism. While Muhammad Ali did a lot to build Egyptian power to bring Egypt into the modern era, Ali came from Albania and had a European tilt. Urabi, on the other hand, was more relatable. I should say that Egyptians didn't have a problem with foreigners living in the country. The issue was more over government and politics. So, Ahmed Urabi launches a rebellion, and he overthrows Ismail Pasha's successor, who was named Tawfiq Pasha, and he set up a new government where European interests maybe don't get as much attention as they would have gotten. In this charged environment, however, something terrible would happen. One day in Alexandria, which was home to a diverse community of Europeans and Egyptians, a riot that would see the deaths of Europeans and Egyptians. The European deaths, however, they would matter to the British. The British wanted to get rid of Ahmed Urabi. As Tora Osman puts it in this book, the British saw themselves as protectors of European minorities in Egypt. And this paper by Marcia Boursoy adds that the British may have used the riots as an excuse to launch a military intervention against the Urabi Revolt. The British sent a naval fleet off the coast of Alexandria, and they demanded that the Egyptians dismantle their coastal defenses. And when the Egyptians refused, the British bombarded the city and sent in occupation forces. The British bombardment of Alexandria has a section dedicated to it in the modern-day Library of Alexandria, which discusses the topic in more detail. Anyway, as Wikipedia tells it, the British then took over the Suez Canal, and after fighting the Egyptian army at the Battle of Tel Kebir, entered Cairo. It was at this point that Urabi was forced to surrender, and the era of British occupation began. The Urabi Revolt, though, wasn't the end. In reality, it was only the beginning. Although the country fell to British occupation, its political psyche did not. Before we continue talking about the British occupation, however, there's a big part of this story that we didn't mention. Remember when I was talking about Ismail Pasha? Well, Egypt at the time was also ruling Sudan, and Ismail Pasha would expand Egyptian control over Sudan and even enter a war with Ethiopia. How did that turn out, especially with the British occupation? Well, that is what the next episode is about, so stay tuned for it. Until then, thank you for watching.